is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
The Hidden Killers Podcast.
With Tony Bruschi.
We are talking with Joni Johnston today about Leslie Van Houten. Who is Leslie Van Houten, you ask? Well, she was one of Manson's followers. Yes, that Manson. And she's up for parole. It's happened a few times. Parole board recommends it, and then it gets shot down by the governor, typically. But she's up again. Someone like this who was involved with a horrible, horrible crime. She helped Manson kill the grocery store chain owner Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary in 1969. Stabbed her 14 times. And then after the grisly murders, sat down into the fridge, had themselves some watermelon. Not making it up. Had a little snack and then left. Carved words into their bodies, painted on the walls with their blood. But now she's in her 70s. She has been a model prisoner most of her life, but is someone who was at one time capable of doing something like this ever truly rehabilitated? Joni?
I definitely think that yes is my answer.
Okay. How?
When you have a situation, I mean, first of all, let me be very clear that this was a heinous crime. And it's understandable that there has been a public outcry every time this person's been up for parole.
Sure.
And so I think, a bigger question for us as a society really is, okay, what is the purpose of the justice system in this case?
Sure.
If we're looking at, violence risk, is this person going to go out and hurt somebody else?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no evidence whatsoever. I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that she would never do that.
I agree.
That she would never hurt anybody else. I think a lot of people would bet a lot of money on that.
Yeah.
So if the question is, okay, is this person a violence risk at this point? Then I think clearly the answer is no. The parole board has obviously thought that on more than one occasion.
Yeah.
She has a pretty amazing track record inside prison. Now, if I'm if one of the victims was my loved one, I might feel completely differently. In other words, I might say, I don't care if this person will never hurt another human being in their lives. They've already earned a life in prison, as far as I'm concerned, by killing my loved one.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at the age of this offender, you look at the circumstances, and you're absolutely right. I'm not in any way implying, Tony, that she didn't have free will.
Sure.
I think, though, the younger a person is, the more the situation can influence them. Mm-hmm. And so is this somebody who I think on their own would have done this? No, I don't. And I think the situation facilitated this crime for sure. And when you have a crime that's been facilitated like this, I think the odds of them doing it again without that influence, particularly when they're in their 70s, is minuscule.
Sure. And I don't look at her as like, oh, she's going to get out and go repeat this. I highly doubt anything like that would ever happen. But it's more so that the principle and understanding, like you said, of what is the purpose of our justice system. Just because you're old, it doesn't necessarily wipe away what you did when you were younger.
You're absolutely, it doesn't.
No.
You know what? You cannot wipe that away.
No.
Right? There's nothing that she can ever do that's going to make up for what she did.
So what, at this point, the idea, I mean, she was once on death row, and then that, got commuted down, and now we're talking about letting her out. Why is there so much concern for her well-being, I guess, and being humane, quote unquote? She seems to have lived a fairly purposeful life behind bars. Why not just let her finish that out? Why do we feel the need of maybe we should let you go after all these years?
I think what happens, and we see this in the criminal justice system in various states over and over again, and when you see this in our country, we'll have this kind of, period in our history where the death penalty is legal in California.
Sure.
Then we have it where it's not legal, right? I mean, we've seen these changes in our country over time.
Yeah.
Then we have it where it's legal, but the governor says, well, not on my watch.
Sure.
Right. It was. So I think what happens is that public sentiment, political sentiment changes and shifts back and forth. And so the crime is the same, right? But the public sentiment around it changes.
Mm-hmm.
Or the political sentiment around it changes. And what you see are the laws reflect that.
Sure.
At one point, juveniles could get the death penalty. Now, juveniles could get life without parole. Then at some point, the Supreme Court said, no, they can't unless they're incorrigible. So again, those crimes were the same.
Yeah.
They were still juveniles. So it really is, I think, the way our society views these crimes and the potential or I guess the cost or the penalties that are justifiable. That's what changes over time.
And that's, I mean, it's looking at something, I think, in the perspective of history of were you, it's very real to people. If you were alive when this happened, you could go, oh, this is horrible. And all these years later, yeah, still horrible. But if it's something just in a history book or something that's just in a documentary or a horror movie, it almost creates a sense of distance, a space, and I think a lack of understanding of the reality of what this once was. And then sometimes you have people who are going from that perspective because they weren't around, and they're taking it more from a perspective of historical versus real life. I think we all feel that way sometimes based on learning things that happened before us or after us, in terms of what impact it made. And letting someone like this out, you're essentially re-victimizing the families of those who are still around who lost their loved one for the sake of someone who committed this crime, so they can have a good 10 years of life outside of jail. It just seems like we're prioritizing the person who was the perpetrator over the victims' families.
I think an argument can be made for that, Tony. Absolutely. I mean, you have a family of a victim. This family had no control over what happened to their loved one. And by letting somebody out who is the person who killed their loved one, mm-hmm. I'm sure they had those same feelings. Once again, they're having no control over the outcome. And I mean, I've heard arguments made that really, when you're talking about letting somebody out that's committed a horrible crime like this, maybe the family should have the say. Mm-hmm. And whether this person gets out or not. I don't think that will ever happen. But sure. I think that there's a valid argument to be made for that, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I was alive at the time when this happened. I remember that happening, and I remember how horrible and what an impact it had on all of us.
Sure.
That happened. So I completely agree with you. And you're absolutely, my children have no idea.
Yeah.
It's like reading out of a book.
Exactly.
And I think, it gives me a little tiny sense of what it's like to be a family member of, homicide victim versus somebody who's watched a documentary on it.
100.
Right? The feelings are very, very different.
It is. And that, I think, changes perspective. It's almost, if you could select, well, who's going to make these decisions, they better have been around to know what it was like at the time, not just the perspective of this is history.
Yes. And I guess that's why, it's in the hands of the parole board, who sees, offender after offender after mm-hmm. offender, reviews their records. And then, as we both were talking about, even the parole board can be kind of reined in.
Yep.
The governor will come in and say no. And I think you're right. I think, that veto or that in the public outcry is reflective of what you're talking about, that there are people saying, yeah, no matter how much this person has changed, they've already earned the right to spend the rest of their life in prison.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast.
The Hidden Killers Podcast.
With Tony Bruschi.
You want to weigh in on this or any case we're following, you can call us at 888-5-KILLER, 888-554-5537. Call it 24/7. We'd love to hear your opinion. We may use it on a future episode of the show. You can follow me on Twitter at TonyBPod. My name is Tony Bruschi. Stay with us.